Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at an evolutionary theory, this idea that young men are basically wired for risk.
And we're slamming it right up against some pretty stark clinical data from neurotrauma wards.
Yeah, our mission here is to unpack a really comprehensive study. It was published in Frontiers in Neurology. It dug into severe traumatic brain injuries, or sTBI.
Right, and they use this framework, the young male syndrome, to try and predict, who gets hurt and, crucially, who dies.
And the results, especially around survival, well, they kind of flip what we normally assume about risk on its head.
They really do. It gets quite surprising.
And the backdrop here, the scale of this problem, it's huge. We're talking serious global health impact.
Absolutely. The WHO, the World Health Organization, they've estimated TBI will be one of the top 3 most frequent causes of death worldwide by the end of this decade.
Wow, it's a massive crisis.
Yeah.
And it tends to hit one particular group harder, right?
That's where the young male syndrome, or YMS, comes in. It's the evolutionary context. The theory basically says males, generally aged between 15 and 35,
Wow.
they engage in way more high-risk behavior. Think reckless driving, fights, extreme sports, that kind of thing.
Driven by competition.
Exactly, intense intrasexual competition. Evolutionarily speaking, it's framed as a strategy to maximize fitness, even though, well, obviously it leads to a much higher chance of accidental death.
Okay, so the basic hypothesis seems pretty straightforward then. Young men take more risk, so they get injured more severely, and therefore, tragically, they die more often from those injuries.
That's the standard prediction from the YMS framework, yeah. Higher risk should equal higher mortality in that group.
But making that leap requires solid data.
It does, and understanding how they got that data is really key here.
Okay, let's dive into the study specifics. Where did the data come from?
So the researchers used a clinical database from PECS in Hungary. They looked at 365 patients over a 10-year period, 2002 to 2012.
And not just any TBI, right? These
No.
were severe cases.
Critically important point. Yes, severe. They defined sTBI using the Glasgow Coma Scale, the GCS score, a score less than 9.
And for anyone not familiar, GCS under 9. That's serious trouble.
Extremely serious. You're often talking about patients in a deep coma. So this study is laser focused on the really critical, life-threatening end of the TBI spectrum.
And even just looking at who gets these injuries, there's a big difference between men and women.
Oh, definitely. That's seen pretty much everywhere. You look globally, the male-to-female ratio for TBI cases is usually somewhere between 3 to 1 and even up to 5 to 1.
So men are already the majority of patients.
Overwhelmingly so, which, on the surface seems to support the idea that they are the bigger risk takers.
Okay, but then how do you measure how risky the behavior was that caused the injury? That sounds tricky, comparing a car crash to falling off a ladder.
Yeah, that's a methodological hurdle. They used a slightly novel approach, maybe a bit subjective, some might say.
How'd they do it?
They actually got university students to read the clinical notes, the descriptions of how the injury happened, like a car accident, a fight, a fall, and the students rated the behavior leading up to it on a 5-point risk scale. This let the researchers group the injuries into low, moderate, or high-risk clusters.
High risk. What kind of things fell into that category? Can you give examples?
Sure. Things like driving heavily intoxicated, engaging in really dangerous activities like, say, some extreme sports, or getting into aggressive fights, especially if drunk.
Okay.
The idea was conscious involvement where severe consequences were, pretty likely.
I have to jump in here, though. Using university students, isn't that inherently a bit, biased? Judging risk is subjective.
Yeah.
How do you standardize comparing a drunken brawl to, say, speeding without a seatbelt?
That's a totally fair point, and the authors do acknowledge it. Their defense was that the students were kept blind. They didn't know the patient's outcome, just the circumstances. So while risk is subjective, the goal was to apply a consistent layperson's perception of danger. It basically created a behavioral score they could then test against the YMS predictions.
Got it. So it's a proxy for perceived riskiness. Let's see what happened when they tested that first YMS idea.
Yeah.
That young males, 15 to 35, would dominate that high-risk category.
And right away, here's the first big curveball. When they crunched the numbers, used some quite sophisticated statistical models to control for different factors,
Yeah.
the classic YMS prediction didn't quite hold up. Age, just age itself, turned out to be a much stronger predictor of risky behavior leading to sTBI than sex was.
Whoa, hang on. You're saying being young was more important than being male in predicting the risk level. That seemed to knock a big hole in the young male syndrome idea.
It definitely makes it more complicated. What they found was that patients aged 15 to 35 were roughly 10 times more likely to have got their sTBI from a high-risk behavior compared to a low-risk one when you compare them to the older group, 36 to 65.
10 times. So young people in general, not just young men specifically.
Exactly. Young people, full stop, were disproportionately involved in the high-risk activities that led to these severe injuries in this cohort.
So youth drives the risk, but maybe sex isn't the whole story for explaining why it results in such severe trauma.
They didn't stop there, did they? They brought in alcohol.
Right, alcohol. It's just a massive factor in TBI clinically. It's a huge risk factor, not just because, bad judgment leads to accidents, but it actually makes the injury outcome worse.
How does it do that physically, make the brain injury worse?
Well, after the initial impact, the primary injury, there's secondary damage, swelling, lack of oxygen. That's often the killer.
Right.
Alcohol seems linked to worse cerebral hypoperfusion and hypoxia. Basically, less blood flow, less oxygen gets to the damaged brain. So if you arrive at the hospital intoxicated after an sTBI, your prognosis tanks.
And given that link between youth, males, risk, and often alcohol, did adding alcohol into their analysis bring things back towards the YMS predictions? It did, yeah. At least on the behavioral side, alcohol turned out to be critical when they modeled age, sex, and alcohol use all together.
Then fit.
Then the findings lined up much better with YMS. That combination, youth, being male, and being intoxicated, that seemed to explain the really high-risk behaviors leading to sTBI. Alcohol is like the fuel on the fire for that YMS tendency.
Okay, so YMS gets a partial rescue on the behavior front once you account for alcohol. But now we hit the really big puzzle, mortality. This is where that simple equation, high risk equals high death rate, just falls apart.
Completely apart. Hypothesis 2, predicting higher mortality for young males due to risk, was flat out rejected by the data.
The clinical facts were the opposite.
Pretty much. First, just looking overall, mortality rates went up significantly with age. That makes clinical sense. Older bodies don't recover as well.
Sure.
But the young group, 15 to 35, they were about 9 times more likely to survive their sTBI compared to the 36 to 65 group.
9 times more likely to live despite being involved in riskier stuff. That's a massive biological advantage for youth.
Huge advantage. But here's the bit that really, as you said, stops you in your tracks. The finding within that young group.
Go on.
Okay, so for patients aged 15 to 35, get this. There is a 3 times higher chance of survival if their injury resulted from a moderate or highly risky behavior compared to a low-risk behavior.
Wait, what? 3 times higher survival if you got seriously hurt doing something risky. That just seems wrong.
Are they saying it's somehow safer to get a severe TBI from, street racing than falling down the stairs?
In that specific 15 to 35 age group, according to this data, yes, suffering that severe injury from doing something risky appeared somehow protective.
How on earth do they explain that?
This is where the authors propose their evolutionary fix for the paradox. They call it preparedness to danger.
Preparedness to danger. Okay, let's break that down. It sounds like they're arguing that actually taking risks builds some kind of survival skill.
Wow.
That's the core idea. The theory suggests that people who frequently put themselves in dangerous, high-stress situations get better, maybe unconsciously, at handling the resulting trauma if an accident happens.
So it's not just luck. It's like an acquired ability to lessen the blow.
Or maybe manage the immediate aftermath better to mitigate the harmful consequences. Yeah, even subconsciously.
Can you give me a practical example of how that might play out?
Okay, think about maybe a professional stunt performer or someone who plays high-contact sports regularly versus, say, an office worker who rarely experiences physical danger.
Right.
If the stunt performer has a bad fall, their body might react instinctively bracing differently, positioning to minimize impact, maybe even staying mentally clearer despite the injury to seek help faster.
Whereas the person who has a simple, unexpected fall
might have absolutely zero physical or mental preparation for that level of sudden trauma. Their system is completely shocked.
So repeated exposure to risky situations might create a kind of muscle memory for chaos, a behavioral or reflexive edge.
That's the hypothesis. This preparedness might limit the initial severity of the injury, perhaps how the brain reacts biochemically, or improve the immediate post-injury response. Maybe the brain is just more accustomed to handling extreme stress and adrenaline surges.
And if that's true, it really reframes the whole male-female difference in TBI outcomes, too.
Exactly. The study points out that because women, generally speaking, engage in fewer high-risk activities,
Their relative lack of experience.
their inexperience with danger could mean that when they do suffer a severe TBI, it might actually be more devastating on average, even though it happens less often overall.
So low frequency of risk might lead to higher severity when trauma does strike, paradoxically.
That's the implication. Being unprepared for the chaos could make the injury outcome worse.
Okay, but I have to push back a bit again. Isn't there a risk of hindsight bias here? Saying the survivors of high-risk incidents were prepared feels a bit like inferring the cause from the outcome. How do we know they were prepared beforehand?
And that is the major limitation, which the authors are upfront about. Preparedness to danger is an evolutionary hypothesis they've put forward to explain the surprising statistical result.
The result being that low-risk sTBI in young people was weirdly more fatal than high-risk sTBI.
Exactly. The data shows that paradox very clearly. Preparedness is their best theoretical bridge to explain why that might be. It suggests risk takers aren't just impulsive, they might also develop a kind of functional awareness of danger that helps protect them.
Which, if true, has massive implications for how we try to prevent these injuries.
Huge. You can't just have a blanket avoid all risks message. Prevention needs to be much smarter, tailored to age, sex, and the type of risk.
And what were the main causes in this study group?
Falls were the biggest single cause, almost half the cases, 49%. Then autovehicular accidents were next at about 18%. Two very different kinds of events.
Right, so for the younger group, prevention has to hammer home the dangers of things like risky driving and drinking, which ties back into that YMS plus alcohol finding.
Definitely. Autovehicular safety, alcohol awareness, that's key for the 15 to 35s.
But for older people.
The focus has to shift almost entirely to preventing falls. Totally different strategy needed.
So, summing up, YMS, especially with alcohol, might predict who takes the risks. But age, and possibly this preparedness idea, seems much better at predicting who actually survives a severe injury.
That's a great summary. The willingness to court chaos might be partly evolutionary, but the experience gained from it could, counterintuitively, be life-saving.
It really forces you to think differently about risk. Okay, so what's the final provocative thought this deep dive leaves us with?
Well, we've landed on this idea that awareness or preparedness for danger seems protective, at least in younger people suffering sTBI.
Right.
But the study leaves a huge practical question hanging. If this preparedness is real and it helps survival, how on earth do we measure it before someone gets hurt? It's easy to say post hoc, but prospectively.
Yeah. How do you quantify preparedness for danger in a healthy population?
Exactly. And maybe even more challenging, how do you design public health messages or interventions that genuinely increase that useful risk awareness without accidentally making people more likely to do the reckless things in the first place?
That's a really tricky balance. Boosting awareness without encouraging the behavior itself.
Finding that sweet spot between educating about danger and preventing unnecessary exposure, that seems like the next big challenge for neurotrauma prevention. How do we cultivate that protective awareness safely?